Hi, this is Greg Kesich at the Portland Press-Herald, and I'm here with Bill Nemitz and our colleague Joe Lawlor, who is our healthcare reporter, who had an interesting story on Saturday, a sit-down interview with Senator Susan Collins. So thanks for coming in, Joe.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, we've been reading a lot about Susan Collins from Washington, but it was, we don't get to talk to her too often in Maine. And I was wondering, you want to just tell us the story of that interview, how that came about and why you were interested in talking to her?
Sure. Obviously, there was a very dramatic vote July 27th on the floor of the Senate, and Bill Nemitz, our columnist, did a nice interview with her on the phone. But what we wanted to do is go into a little bit more detail about what her thinking was, what happens next. She has always been, over the course of the past several months, I've interviewed her on several different occasions, mostly by phone, a couple of times in person. And she's always been very, very detailed when talking about healthcare and going beyond talking points that a lot of politicians stick to. She really knew the subject matter. She and I could talk about the intricacies of Affordable Care Act policy, and she really knows her stuff down to the nitty gritty, and that's struck me as kind of unusual. Her background is lends itself. Already, you could tell from her background that that's part of the answer as to why. Because back in the late 1980s, when she was only in her 30s, by the way, she, under Governor McKernan, she headed up, she was commissioner, and her title was really long, but she headed up several agencies, and one of them was a Bureau of Insurance. And so clearly that was part of the reason why she knows so much about, insurance markets, pools, reinsurance, all these things that really gets into how this works, why it might work, be improved or fail. And these, might be considered kind of boring, but it's the reason why things work or don't work. So they're really, sometimes boring is important. So
right. It's not boring if it's your health.
It's not boring if you have a 25% premium increase and deductibles of several $1,000s, and there was an easy fix and the government didn't do it.
So was she referring to, when she said her experience in the 80s, was she referring to the workers' comp crisis?
Yes.
It sounded that way, yeah.
Yeah.
So that was a situation where prices went sky high, and there was a big debate about how to manage
and state government
costs.
Shut down.
Right.
In the process. I mean,
Yeah.
that was one of the all-time great political crises in Augusta history.
Right. I mean, even though I had a sit-down with her at her Portland office, which has really nice views of the waterfront, by the way.
Don't they all?
She, I still only had a little over 20 minutes, so we couldn't get into super great detail. But definitely the workers' compensation crisis. So she was heading up an agency that was where the market collapsed, and so she had to deal with that firsthand, and state government had to deal with that firsthand. So that was part of the motivating factor there. Is she saw what happened when it collapsed and what the fallout was and how to deal with it, and so it's better to prevent something bad from happening. She saw that the various GOP efforts to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, if they continue to go down those tracks, it would have caused insurance markets to collapse and many, many more millions of people to be without insurance. There's a whole lot of reasons for that. And there's many insurance experts, that's not just politicians talking. That's insurance experts, Congressional Budget Office analysis, many different Kaiser Family Foundation, many, these AARP, many of these very staid, down the middle type organizations all saying the same thing. So
one thing you had in your story that struck me was these meetings that she was holding. This goes probably back into July, I assume, with a bipartisan group of senators. I remember hearing little tidbits about that then, and what that told me are two things. Number one, that she fully anticipated the Republican efforts to collapse and was already looking beyond that. And number two, that she's in a position right now as a senator to maybe with one or two others, convene such a group. How did she seem in terms of her level of optimism on that? Does she really think that's going to be the way to go here?
She always seems optimistic. But I don't know if how much she is really optimistic or if it's just wishful thinking. But definitely there are meetings occurring. There's many obstacles to getting something done, but there are a lot of meetings occurring. And she convened the first of these private meetings back during the same week where they were having all these votes that ended up in that early Friday morning vote to where John McCain gave the thumbs down that ended the Obamacare repeal effort. There was a small bipartisan group of senators, no staff, just the senators present, meeting in undisclosed locations. One of those meetings was, and there's about 10 to 12 Democrats and Republicans in these meetings, and one of those meetings was organized and convened by Susan Collins. So definitely she is at the center of whatever is going to come about. And she also mentioned that there are going to be, starting the week after Labor Day, there are going to be hearings with the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, of which Collins is a member, and they're going to be talking to state insurance commissioners, again, the people who really have to deal with this stuff, and on a practical level, and also governors, Democratic and Republican governors who have been dealing with Medicaid expansion and how to implement the Affordable Care Act.
So she had a lot to say about sort of the process and how the compromise could come about. But did she get into any ideas about what the compromise would be? I mean, what are when people say we want to shore up the markets, what do they mean by that?
Well, we didn't have time to talk about that specifically because that's like probably a half hour or 45-minute conversation just about policy, and nobody really knows exactly what is going to be the compromises. One of the most interesting ones, she mentioned there was a group in the House, I believe it's about 20 to 30 House members, both Democrats and Republicans, centrists, who have they call themselves the Problem Solvers Caucus. And she did mention that she has spoken with them. They have actually come out with a proposal, kind of the outlines of a proposal. And the big compromise there is that you would pump more money into reinsurance programs, and reinsurance is just a fancy way of saying that it makes the pool of money that you tap into stronger, keeps rates lower, and smooths out for insurance companies problems with people with high expensive claims.
Defray the most expensive customers,
right?
And so that it makes the premium rate lower for everybody.
Right. So in exchange for that, the compromise there is you would do that, and then you would relax the employer mandates that the ACA has. And so right now, if you're a company that has 50 or more employees, you're mandated to offer insurance. This compromise would lift that cap to 500, with the idea that some small companies struggle because it's expensive to offer insurance to full-time employees. And so some companies struggle with that. And so the idea is that this would give companies flexibility to not offer insurance, but then people would be buying insurance from an individual marketplace that was improved.
So it's interesting. You mentioned the John McCain moment with the thumbs up, and she, of course, had already voted in a less dramatic way, but we have a tape of that, and we can hear it.
It was one of the more dramatic and important votes that I've had to cast in my time in the Senate. we generally voted in alphabetical order, so I was cognizant of the fact that I would be the first Republican to cast my vote against the bills. More interesting, perhaps, earlier in the evening, Lisa Murkowski and I had walked over to talk to John McCain. He knew our decision, and we were talking, and all of a sudden he pointed to both of us and said, "You two are right." And that's when I knew that he was going to vote no. And shortly after that, I felt a tap on my shoulder, and I turned around, and it was the vice president. He initially had come over thinking he was going to break the tie vote, and instead, he had learned that John was undecided, so he had come over to talk to John McCain. So he turned to me and he said, "Boy, you are really tough." And then he put his arm around me to sort of soften the impact of his words a bit. And I've always had a very good relationship with the vice president. He's very gracious. And then it became obvious that he wanted to have a private conversation with John. So Lisa and I backed off so that could occur. And then the president called John during right before the roll call. He wasn't there when his name was called the first time, as he was talking to the president in the cloakroom. So the suspense is building among most of our members. I knew, what he was going to do, and Lisa knew. And then he came back, went down to the well rather than voting from his seat, and put his thumb down. So it was a very dramatic moment, and a very significant moment. I know that there are a lot of problems with the ACA that we need to fix, and I believe we will start on that with the hearings in the first week in September. But I believe that had those bills passed and become law, that it would have been a disaster.
How did she appear when she was talking to you about sort of how she felt about not backing the majority of her party in that moment?
I think it was definitely hard for her, but at the same time, she had studied the issue so much and was able to, there's all kinds of studies about how this would have caused rural hospitals to potentially close and cause millions of people to not have access to insurance anymore. And so I think she was comfortable in her decision. She knew it was significant and momentous, and even Collins didn't really know what was going to happen until that evening. So, I mean, they were meeting in anticipation that it might fail, but nobody really knew that it would fail until, and Bill, you did a great job of talking to her in the immediate aftermath about kind of the blow by blow.
Yeah, everybody was watching McCain, and there were some early indications when Vice President Pence left the floor. A lot of people said, he didn't win over McCain. But what struck me about that quote you had with her, and it struck me about her before, is Susan Collins doesn't get all that emotional about a lot of things. It's one thing, she's very steady, very even. She doesn't, if she has a temper, she doesn't show it publicly. And what struck me whenever we go into these questions about bucking the tide, going against your party, is how painful that is for her, and how deep those Republican roots run in her. So, and I heard it in the quote that she gave you as well, that this is not easy. In fact, as she noted, she was first of the Republicans to vote no, and that's historic in and of itself. And I could hear that through the quote, that kind of angst that she feels when she has to step up and do something like that. It's not easy.
I think also too with the Senate, unlike the House, there's 100 members of the Senate. It's kind of like you get to know them over several years. You get to have very personal relationships with a lot of these folks. if you get presumably have closer relationships with people that you're caucusing with amongst your own party, and so
it's more personal.
It's more personal. It's more personal.
It struck me that McCain could surprise everybody and shock everybody, but that's not the way she operates. She carefully laid the groundwork for that vote, and it was not a surprise the day of the vote how she was going to vote. And
no, it was a foregone conclusion.
I think she worked with her colleagues and let them know that she wasn't just going to turn the tables on them. Whereas McCain, the maverick.
Here's one other question I got. How does Susan Collins, in doing all of this, and you look at Lisa Murkowski and you look at Jeff Flake and you can go down, obviously McCain, Lindsey Graham, how does she stay out of the crosshairs of Donald Trump when she does this stuff? Did she talk at all about the president?
No, I didn't have
which is really
time.
Impossible to get her to do. Yet she manages to do these things without touching off a Twitter storm in which she's the central subject.
That mystifies me. I didn't have an opportunity to ask her about the president. It was one of my very next questions, but we only had a certain amount of time. But that's an impossible. Why the president targets some people and doesn't target others? I have no idea.
So, Bill, that's looking forward in terms of policy stuff, but the other big question about Susan Collins is politics and what her plans are, and she's told us that we're not going to find out until later this fall. But are you hearing anything or seeing anything that gives you any clue into which direction she might be headed?
No, other than logic.
And again, I'm talking about her possibility she might run for governor.
Yeah, for governor. She's not tipped her hand to anyone that I've spoken with about this definitively. The more this evolves and the higher and higher profile that she has in the Senate, the more I find myself wondering, why on God's earth would she not stay in the Senate right now? I mean, she's in explaining the decision-making process, she said that she wants to be in the position in which she can do the most for Mainers, to which I would respond, and which I might respond in the coming column in the next week or so. Forget about Mainers. You're in a position to significantly affect what's best for Americans right now. You've reached that level, and why she would walk away from that in exchange for the Blaine House is really beyond me. So if I had to guess right now, I would say that she's not going to run for governor. It hit me last week. I was watching NBC News, and they made passing reference to the growing number of Republicans in the Senate who, to one level or another, have had it with Donald Trump. And how often they'll go to the B-roll or go to a headshot or something to show while they're talking about that. And as they mentioned that growing group of Republican senators, her face appeared on the screen without any other comment. And I thought to myself, well, look at that. She is now the primary person in the U.S. Senate with which people associate that sentiment. And I think that speaks volumes about her stature, not with the Trump crowd and not with Mitch McConnell, although he's coming, he's moving too, but more just to basic common sense America. So I think that if you just step back and look at the politics of this, I would be very surprised if she didn't stay put.
She's been, even though she's not a committee chairman or chairwoman, or she has been tapped by Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, the committee chairman, to play a central role on this committee that's going to be coming up with potential fixes to the ACA. And she's already helped get suggestions for who to testify, what types of experts to bring in. And she's also, from what I understand, is going to be very much in the mix in terms of actually coming up with policy. I mean, don't forget she and Bill Cassidy had a bill that didn't end up getting voted on, but it was a bill that was quite a bit to the left of anything that the GOP had proposed, and it was. I don't want to get into all the details of that right now, but it was very much in the center. I just want to say one other thing too about her clout right now. The media in Washington has really, she's more accessible than a lot of politicians in D.C. and because she has taken on a central role in the whole healthcare debate, this was not part of my interview, but another time I interviewed her, she mentioned this. She was, the reporters were like chasing her all over the place and hiding out or, cornering her into wall. And although, she probably didn't enjoy that very much, she would still, for the most part, answer questions and talk about substance and not just be, running away. So, but that is also indicative of the fact that now she has been recognized by the Washington media as a go-to person for healthcare. Yeah. So,
yeah, I haven't confirmed this with her, but I did hear this story that on the night of the vote, the big healthcare vote, when it all ended at 3 o'clock in the morning, everybody was trying to get out of Dodge, and she and I think it was Lindsey Graham, knowing that the press scrum was outside and knowing that they were all going to, pounce on her, were trying to find a way out of the Capitol without having to face the media, and they went through a door and touched off a fire alarm as they went through. So it just, she's of that stature now, where she has to find other escape routes. If
I think they should have asked Bruce Poliquin, because he knows how to to avoid the media.
He's got his own tunnel.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that's coming up is the poll that shows that she would have a hard time winning a Republican primary in Maine, which I find that hard to believe. In real life, I think different people would show up. I don't know how they model that poll in terms of who shows up for the primary, but you wonder, would she want to, at this point in her career, crawl through the mud and have people, saying all kinds of things about how she's not a real Republican, or that she doesn't understand, like Mary Mayhew's saying that Susan Collins doesn't understand the intricacies of health care.
You don't have to go back too far to Olympia Snow's last tentative steps toward re-election before she decided not to seek it, to see just how ugly things can get in the Maine Republican Party right now. I mean, there were things that were just horrible, that she was going into what she thought were friendly audiences. This is Olympia Snow. And just having her head handed to her over and over again by people who were not accustomed to the niceties of political discourse. I mean, these people were vicious. And that, I'm sure, is not lost on Susan Collins. And even if she were to win a Republican gubernatorial primary, you just wonder how much stomach she, or frankly any of us, have for the indignity of that primary campaign. I think that regardless of who actually shows up on primary election day, it would be an ugly thing for her to go through. And so if only half her heart is in it to begin with, then why put yourself through
that?
You know?
And I think the point everybody leaps to is, why doesn't she run as an independent? She could skip the primary. She has tremendous approval ratings. You'd think that she would be the odds-on favorite.
But that goes to what we discussed earlier, and that is that this woman is Republican to the core. And whereas some high-profile politicians have no difficulty at all jettisoning one affiliation for another, or going independent and then going back, or whatever pragmatically might be the thing for them to do, I don't think that's in her DNA. I think that to run as anything other than a Republican, even now with the state of Republican politics, would be just pure heresy for her.
The only rebuttal I would have to that is, it occurred to me this morning that if you had Susan Collins running as an independent in 2018 for governor, and Angus King running as an independent in 2018 for U.S. Senate, you would just about kill the Democratic Party. It would be done forever.
That's true.
Because all the Democrats would tie themselves in knots trying to figure out how they maintain their status as a statewide party when they don't have a candidate that they want to win for either governor or U.S. senator.
To the point where you wonder, in the case of the Senate race, whether they'd even put someone up, whether they're
right.
even
I mean,
run someone.
we've had reports about local town committees, Democratic committees endorsing Angus King already, and
it would certainly be a statement about the Maine independent streak, wouldn't it? I mean, if we had the two of those running for essentially the two highest offices in the state, and neither of them is affiliated.
And I still expect to see LePage in the Senate race. I know he says he isn't, but he says a lot of things that don't later turn out to be true.
That would surprise me far less than Collins running for governor.
Can you imagine having all three of them in the same ballot?
No, I know.
So what's been interesting, too, is it's hard to determine how many of these folks would be Republican primary voters if she were to decide to run for governor. But the reaction from just regular people after she cast her vote has been really interesting. It's been well noted, the spontaneous applause that she got at the Bangor airport when she returned. And, in the August recess, she goes all over like most politicians do. She goes all over the state for various different events. And she's been saying people have just been coming up to her and thanking her and, just lots of high praise for this vote. So it would be interesting to see what her approval rating is now versus after the vote versus last year or something. That would be an interesting poll.
Yeah, it's an enviable position to be in. It's not a question of which race you could win. In her case, I think it's more a case of which office she wants. Right. And that's.
And I guess where she wants to live. I mean, does she want to come back to Maine? I think there's some. I'm told that there's some factors in her decision making that aren't necessarily all policy related, but.
Egads.
Yeah.
Someone makes a personal decision.
But would you take a massive pay cut to have people camped out your office every morning and everything that goes wrong in state government is your fault? Every big storm is something that you have to respond to.
She has the experiences at the commissioner level in Augusta, but as crazy as things seem on Capitol Hill, I can't help but think that Susan Collins going from Congress to an executive position over the Maine legislature would be a shock to her senses. I don't think that. I think Maine state politics has its own idiosyncrasies that she might not be ready for. Yeah.
To go back to something, do you remember the workers' compensation crisis? And do you remember her in particular being
No, actually I don't, because I was sports editor at the time. So I was blissfully, literally on the sidelines for that whole thing. I do remember her role as insurance, she wasn't insurance commissioner, but she was, that office oversaw the office of the insurance commissioner. And I do remember, although kind of ironic that I was sports editor, because that was very much kind of a sports contest. I mean, it really, there were some deeply, deeply dug in heels among the governor and certain legislators, and it was a one for the ages. I mean, it was a real showdown. I don't remember her playing a particularly high profile role in that. That said, knowing her, I'm sure that she was, exceedingly busy.
But the solution that came out of that crisis has held up very well.
Yes,
and it's still around today, and it's the Memic insurance company.
Right. That's really interesting, Greg, that you mentioned that the solution that she was a part of has helped the system, that these were true reforms and not just window dressing. So and maybe that bodes well for what if she has a lot of influence in Congress, and if the final product is similar to what they did with the workers' comp.
I would also note, seeing what regard the media is held in these days, that the Blue Ribbon Commission, which led to Memic, was actually a cause célèbre for this newspaper. And in addition to the reporting, that was one of the times, at least that I remember, early times, where we went from just straight reporting on that issue to what was euphemistically called, I think, expert reporting back then.
Right. It was called putting editorials on page one.
Exactly,
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
But that's where you take the body of work that has resulted from your reporting and writing and then kind of propel that into an advocacy position. And the position was, if I recall, to create this commission, which in turn led to the creation of MEMIC.
Yeah. But I think the thing we're going to find out about Susan Collins and this healthcare compromise going forward the next few months is whether or not there really is a stomach for getting anything done, and whether people just pay lip service to that, or do they really actually want to return to a kind of normal order of business where people horse trade and make choices and resolve disputes and solve big problems. Because there's a lot of indication that politically that's not considered a winner, and a lot of people are having very successful careers in which they just go full out crazy, and I'm not going to compromise with anybody.
And the relationship between McConnell and Trump right now could not be more toxic. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I was just wondering about this morning, wondering, does Mitch McConnell still have it in him to pursue ACA reform because it's the right thing to do? Or has he been so polarized by the assault from the White House that he's not interested in anything that's going to help?
Or are Democrats interested in bailing out the Republicans and giving them a success,
as opposed to waiting for the
insurance.
midterms?
Yeah. So
maybe in this case, though, boring would be good.
Yeah, I'm going for boring. I'm voting for the most boring candidates from now on.
No, I mean I don't mean in terms of candidates. I mean in terms of policy.
Yeah.
I mean, I know from trying to write about this stuff that, writing about reinsurance or pools of people who have high claims and high risk pools, they call it, and health savings accounts and all this stuff, trying to make it relatable to readers is difficult. And no matter how you do it, it's still a health insurance policy, in the weeds kind of thing, and people's eyes might kind of glaze over a little bit. And maybe that might be a good thing in terms of having something pass, because it's not sexy enough to attract a lot of diehard opposition.
The problem is the day that Trump comes out with a Twitter storm against Susan Collins, you tell me what's going to dominate that cycle. And that's the world we live in right now. It's too bad that we can't discuss policy, however difficult that might be, but it's just constantly being hijacked. And I think to some extent, the dilemma the media faces, and at what point do we break away from that and start ignoring a morning Twitter storm from the president? But we're not at that point yet. And if he goes after Collins, we're certainly not going to be at that point there.
Well, until that day, we're going to have to stop this discussion for now, but we'll come back together. And thanks a lot, Joe. This was very helpful.
Yes, thanks, Joe.
Great story.
No problem.
This is a Press Herald podcast. You can hear past episodes at pressherald.com/podcasts. You can subscribe on iTunes, on Android devices, and stream on Stitcher. Please email comments and questions to letterstotheeditor@pressherald.com. Thank you for listening.